Thank you.
Madam
Senator.
Secretary, isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget for next fiscal year is $500 billion more than this fiscal year?
On the spending side?
Yes. That's what a budget is.
Yeah. It is about $400 billion.
It's about $500 billion
in outlays.
more, right?
It's about what?
$500 billion more, right?
About that.
Isn't it a fact that since 2019 until today, I'm not including the extra $500 billion that y'all want to spend, since 2019 through today, U.S. population has increased 1.8%, and the federal government's budget is up 55%. Isn't that a fact?
Well, we had a pandemic.
Isn't that a fact, though? Are my
I'm
numbers
not.
right?
I don't know those numbers.
You don't know? You never looked at that?
I don't have those numbers in my head. I'm not disputing them.
Okay. Isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget proposes $4.7 trillion in new taxes?
It does propose significant additional taxes, yes.
4.7 trillion?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. You talked about reducing deficit. Isn't it a fact that under President Biden's proposed budget, that gross debt will rise from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033?
I'm sorry, what number did you give me for?
The president's proposed budget will increase gross debt from $33 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion in 2033. Isn't that correct?
Well, debt held by the public, which is,
No, ma'am, that's gross debt. Isn't that a fact?
that's probably a fact.
So you haven't reduced the deficit, have you?
The deficit, the debt and deficits are reduced by the president's budget.
How can you go from $33 trillion to $51 trillion and call that a reduction in the deficit?
You call this an improvement? Senator Grills, Treasury Secretary, over $51 trillion debt? Watch this explosive exchange as a U.S. Senator puts the Treasury Secretary on the hot seat over the Biden administration's proposed budget. From $51 trillion in projected debt to $4.7 trillion in new taxes, this fiery budget hearing pulls no punches. Is Bidenomics working, or is it a recipe for economic disaster? Subscribe for more hard-hitting political debates, expert breakdowns, and must-see moments from Washington. Like if you enjoy accountability in government. Comment below, do you think the current fiscal path is sustainable?
At the end of this year, we project people a lot smarter than me, probably not than you, but smarter than me, say that gross debt's $33 trillion. They say if the president's budget is implemented by 2033, it'll be $51 trillion. Isn't that a fact?
If the president's budget is not implemented and none of the changes are made, it will be worse than that. And so the president's budget has improved the fiscal outlook relative to what we would have without the president's proposals.
Even though it raises gross debt from $33 trillion to $51 trillion, you say that's an improvement.
It is an improvement because it raises taxes by more, and it leads to...
That includes taxes. In what world is that an improvement, other than Washington and long land?
It's an improvement in that the revenue increases far exceed proposed investments.
Okay. All right, let me ask you this. Isn't it a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve issued a warning to Silicon Valley Bank over its risk management systems?
I have no idea. I'm not responsible in any way to
But
the
you're in charge of the
supervision.
banking bailouts and the crisis, right?
I am not involved in banking supervision, and I don't have access to any information about the supervision of Silicon Valley Bank.
Do you think the current fiscal path is sustainable? $33 trillion today, projected to hit $51 trillion by 2033, $4.7 trillion in new taxes, and one senator who's not letting the Treasury Secretary off easy. Let's get into it. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget for next year is $500 billion more than this year? On the spending. So about $500 billion more, right? About that. Since 2019, our population increased 1.8%, but the federal budget, up 55%. Isn't that a fact? We had a pandemic. Isn't that a fact? I'm not disputing the numbers. Isn't it a fact that the proposed budget includes $4.7 trillion in new taxes? It does propose significant additional taxes. 4.7 trillion, something like that? Yes. Isn't it a fact that gross federal debt will go from 33 trillion to 51 trillion under this plan? That's probably a fact. So you've reduced the deficit? The president's budget reduces the deficit relative to the baseline. In what world is going from 33 to 51 trillion an improvement?